All right, welcome back to Right on the Edge. I'll be reacting today to a video by Pilot Debrief called "The Real Pilot Mistake That Got Nicole Killed." Um, I'm in pilot training myself, so I would also, like to learn from other people's mistakes. I'm sorry that this one is deadly, but we learn from other people's mistakes so we don't create them in our own lives. Yeah, let's get into it.
Cole. She was 21 years old and just starting her journey as a commercial pilot, and this is the family that was sitting in the back of her plane for what was supposed to be a routine holiday adventure. Instead, their flight turned into a
Oh
terrible
wow.
tragedy as the aircraft they were all flying in plunged into the
So it didn't just get Nicole killed. I'm thinking. I hope we have good news here.
river below, killing them all. But that's not the most shocking part of the story, and that's why we're going to talk about the real pilot mistake that got Nicole and her passengers killed. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your pilot debrief.
Nice to meet you, Hoover.
Our story begins on August 30th, 2022, when Thomas, Cornelia, and their two daughters, Alicia and Paulina, were in Africa where they had just spent the past few days relaxing in a riverside villa, and they were wrapping up their dream holiday vacation. In order to begin the journey home, they waited patiently at a remote airstrip for a plane to pick them up and take them back to Windhoek, the capital city of Namibia. Nicole was 21 years old and she was the pilot flying the plane.
Wow.
We don't know a lot about Nicole's history, but the social media post I found said that she finished her commercial pilot license exams on March 8th, 2021. However, according to the investigation, she didn't actually obtain her commercial pilot license until about 7 months later on October 4th. Then, about a month after that, she posted this image to Facebook saying that her Cessna 210 rating was done. Now, just for clarification,
Congratulations on
in the
that.
United States, you don't need a type rating to fly the Cessna 210, so this is something specific to the country of Namibia. Regardless, the point I want to make is that it appears Nicole got checked out to fly the Cessna 210 in November, which was about 9 months before the crash. If you're not familiar with this aircraft, the Cessna 210 Centurion is a single engine high wing aircraft.
Yeah, I'm gonna guess that this is speculation right now, but if I had to guess early on, kind of what happened was she got checked out to fly it, but maybe wasn't proficient. But let's see what happens.
Craft with 6 seats, and it's very popular for charter flights in regions like Africa, where it can handle short, unimproved airstrips in remote areas. According to the investigation, the aircraft had a valid certificate of airworthiness and had only been flown about 38 hours since its last inspection, and there was nothing wrong with the aircraft that might have contributed to the crash. That brings us back to Nicole.
That's good, and it's also sad. Well, not sad. It's it's in the middle ground here. I'm having I'm having trouble trying to figure out what it is. Not laughing at me or laughing at the situation, laughing at myself.
According to her logbooks, she only had about 82 hours of flight time in the Cessna 210 at the time of the crash, but 80 of those hours were acquired in the previous 90 days, so pretty much all of her experience in the aircraft was fairly recent. That being said, she only had 310 hours of total flight time, and the majority of that was in a Cessna 172, a Piper PA 28, and a Sling 2.
For those not familiar with aviation, Cessna 172 is one of the most popular aircraft on the planet. With the Piper PA and the Piper series probably being number two. I don't know much about the Sling as well. Or though, I don't know much about the Sling.
So, really, she had just started her aviation career and didn't have a lot of experience when it comes to being a commercial pilot responsible for flying around passengers. This is where it's worth pointing out that aviation investigations in other countries typically don't publish all of the supporting documents that they use to make the final report, like the NTSB does here in the US. And the reason why that's important is because there wasn't any information regarding interviews with other pilots that Nicole had flown with or her previous instructors that would help give us a better understanding of her skill and proficiency level.
Yeah, yeah. So, uh, the NTSB here is a organization that you have to file a report with if you ever get into like an accident or there's some sort of mechanical failure, essentially. And some sort of pilot failure. I mean, but anyway, yeah, that's it's too bad we don't have the full story, so we can just speculate on full details.
Level. The only thing we know for certain is that Nicole was working for a company called Scenic Air, which, according to their website, offers you the opportunity to experience Namibia's beauty from a bird's eye view. And it was discovered that about 18 days prior to the crash, the company had been granted an exemption from one of the Part 135 regulations for private charter flights that basically says you can't fly single pilot Part 135 outside of a 50-mile radius of the departure airport unless the pilot has 300 hours of total flight time or holds a valid instrument rating. Now, my understanding from the report is that Nicole was operating under this exemption, at least perhaps for a time being, but either way, the investigation focused on this minor detail, and even though they eventually determined that the flight was legal, afterwards the Namibian Civil Aviation Authority revised the exemption procedures in an effort to improve flight safety. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about the company that Nicole worked for in a minute, but for right now, we need to look at what happened before the flight. On the day of the crash, Thomas and his family made their way to the airfield and got ready for the trip. Meanwhile, Nicole started her day several hours prior at Windhoek, and the plan was to fly to Impalila Island to pick everyone up before heading back to Windhoek. That first flight took about 4 hours.
So she might have been tired as well. Yeah. Flying can take a lot out of you. It's very mentally demanding, even in more simple aircraft.
And was pretty much uneventful, at least right until the very end. And this is where you need to understand that Nicole had never flown into this airfield before. One of the reasons why that matters is because the company flight operations manual says that any pilot which is unfamiliar or hasn't operated to a runway before shall receive a proper runway briefing from the safety manager, flight ops manager, or senior flight.
And all that's true, right? But by the time you're a commercial pilot, you should be able to know how to land at an airport you haven't landed at before. So I'm going to say that it's relevant in the fact that maybe they didn't do their jobs properly, but it's irrelevant because as a pilot in command or PIC, you have to be aware of every landing strip, airport, and taxiway. Like, you have to know this stuff. It's part of your it's part of your pre-flight. But yeah, let's go. Let's continue.
Crew. Unfortunately, the investigation found no evidence that Nicole got that briefing prior to conducting the flight to the island or prior to the flight that got her and her passengers killed.
Like I said, that's unfortunate, but at the end of the day, it's your responsibility as a pilot in command. Like, no excuses. It just sucks that it ended up being like this.
According to aircraft data, Nicole made her initial approach from the west and overflew the airfield before circling back around to land on runway 10. Thomas and his family were outside, and they watched as Nicole made what was described by eyewitnesses as an unstable landing where she ballooned the aircraft before eventually getting it under control and bringing it to a stop by the end of the runway. All right, I want to pause right here for just a second.
Ballooning isn't necessarily a terrible thing. It happens occasionally, but essentially it's where you pull up too suddenly on the yoke during a landing, like when you're trying to level off to bring the speeds down. And ballooning can happen with just, it could be like a gust of wind or just, a little bit of ground effect catches you. It's people do this, people balloon every day and still land. It's not as big of a deal as people might think it is who don't know about aviation.
Because even though the investigation didn't talk about this, my guess is that this could have been embarrassing for Nicole, knowing that she screwed up the landing in front of the passengers that she was about to pick up.
That's fair, I think, but it's speculation, and the layman passenger probably wouldn't know anything.
Which is just one more factor that could have increased her stress level and played a very small role in the crash. Either way, Thomas and his family made their way to the plane, and Nicole helped their driver load the bags. But Nicole soon realized that the luggage was too heavy, and she decided to offload two of the big bags. That's when
That's smart. At least she was aware of the handbook, you know, the pilot handbook, or not the pilot handbook, but the aircraft handbooks, and knew it was going to fuck up with the center of gravity.
she called her company to let them know what was going on, telling them that the bags were too heavy because the tail of the aircraft was almost touching the ground. Now, in my opinion, this would have been the perfect time for Nicole's company to review the weight and balance and take off performance calculations with her, just to
Exactly.
make sure that everything was good. And it also would have been a great time to give her the airfield briefing that they were required to, even though she had already landed there. Unfortunately, they didn't do.
I'll agree with that. I will agree with that. Um, because obviously the company shares some responsibility in this. However, the weight and balance thing and stuff like that, yeah, that's your job to know every aspect of it. So I don't know how Africa works, but you'd have to know how much that luggage weighs before you could even do the flight. Um, at least a close approximate, right? Before you could even do the flight. I mean, you can, yeah, you just shouldn't, you know?
Do any of that, and allegedly all they told her to do was to leave the extra luggage with the driver. Now, don't get me wrong, Nicole is the pilot in command, and it's her responsibility to familiarize herself with the airfield and do the weight.
There you go. Okay, good. I'm glad he brought that up because it seemed like running defense for a little bit. But no, no, thanks, man. I appreciate you bringing it up, and I'm sorry I doubted you.
Balance calculations.
This guy probably has like 1,000 hours more than me, more than I ever will. But yeah, yeah,
But I'd argue that the company also has a responsibility to set her up for success.
I'll agree with that. Yeah, yeah. The company has the responsibility. Well, not just that, but it's also like a financial uh it's a financial problem if they don't try to set up their people for success. You know, this could lead to all sorts of financial ruin. Like obviously, the loss of a life it far outweighs that. But if you're a company, you should be considering like all aspects.
And make sure that she was comfortable with the situation, especially considering her limited experience, and it appears like that didn't happen. However, in full transparency, when it comes to the investigation, it's not clear if Nicole calculated the weight and balance prior to the flight because the final report said her flight log reflected 240 liters of fuel on board the aircraft, but the report also said the weight and balance done by Nicole the day prior to the crash was found to have inaccurate data, including the wrong fuel quantity, as well as the wrong luggage weight and weight of the pilot and passengers. So
Ah, yeah. I mean, it could be one-time mistake, or it could be that she was just lying about the numbers because maybe in her mind, right? She's like, "Oh, it doesn't matter." Yeah, yeah. That's rough, man.
Well, I'm not sure if they're trying to say that Nicole didn't do the calculations correctly or what. And there wasn't any further.
Uh, I think that's implying like nefarious means to it. Like, you know, I kind of just implied it too, right? Because it could be like a pattern. But saying that it happened one time, that's not indicative of a pattern. It's more like she could have just messed up the math or something.
Details to elaborate on this. Instead, the final report provided this table showing that based on their calculations, the aircraft was 75 pounds over the max gross weight allowable when Nicole took off. And this other chart showed that the center of gravity appeared to have been within the limits of the aircraft. The only problem with all of this is that there was one more factor they needed to consider. It was 31 degrees Celsius that day, and with a field elevation of about 3,000 feet, that meant the density altitude was around 5,500 feet at the time Nicole tried to take off. The investigation didn't.
The density, altitude, and stuff plays an important role for, you know, just educating people who might not know. But essentially, with a higher density altitude, you need more runway space. It takes longer to take off. You need more power to take off, right? For every, let's just say for 8,000, if it's an 8,000 feet density altitude, you know, it takes twice the length, like twice the runway length to establish lift of the aircraft. So, I mean, yeah. Shit, man. It's tragedy here. This is a tragedy.
Didn't talk about this at all. In fact, the final report said that weather was not a factor in this crash, but I'd argue that it was because the aircraft is not going to perform as well at a
Oh, also the aircraft doesn't perform as well at higher temperatures. Like, I was focused on the other thing, forgot the obvious.
high density altitude compared to operating at sea level. And once again, this is something that could have been easily discussed if Nicole had gotten an airfield briefing from her company. Instead, she finished loading everyone into the aircraft and got ready to take off, not knowing they only had a few minutes left to live.
Man, that's rough. So they crashed a few minutes after takeoff. Wow. All right. The flight.
Thomas sat up front with Nicole for the flight, and his wife and 2 daughters sat in the back as the aircraft back taxied down the runway for a departure on runway 10. Nicole called air traffic control and said that they would be departing soon, and the controller acknowledged the request and told Nicole to report when airborne. A few minutes later, Nicole took off, and as soon as she got airborne, she got on the radio again, and that's when the controller asked her if she would be departing via the Caprivi Strip. Now, that's the part of Namibia that sticks out like a panhandle leading to Impalila Island, and Nicole said yes. The controller then gave her a new frequency to change to, but there was no reply, and Nicole was never heard from again as the aircraft crashed into the river just a few seconds later.
Wow. I wonder what happened in those few seconds. I mean, hopefully it goes into that, but I've learned more about geography of Africa in this video than I have almost anything else, but that's still pretty cool.
Now, in order to understand what went
awful, not cool, awful. There we go. Let's do it right.
wrong during the flight, you need to know that the runway Nicole was using was 1,300 meters long, which is about 4,200 feet. And that's more than enough runway for a Cessna 210, so this should have been a normal takeoff procedure.
Yeah, I was gonna say in a Cessna 210 at max weight at that altitude, maybe 1,500 feet of runway, 2,000 feet of runway maybe.
And that means, according to the checklist, the flaps will typically be set to 10 degrees, and you're going to rotate at 60 knots, or about 69 miles per hour. Then you're going to climb out initially at 80 knots, with your best rate of climb being 89 knots. And even though it doesn't necessarily specify it on this checklist, I've been told that in a Cessna 210, you usually don't want to raise the flaps below 90 knots. Regardless, it's important to understand what happened after Nicole took off. You see, shortly after getting airborne, Nicole began a left-hand turn, and eyewitnesses watched in horror as she made it about halfway through the turn when all of a sudden the bank angle of the aircraft rapidly increased until the left wing was pointing almost 90 degrees down.
Wow. Wow. A full 50-degree turn on takeoff while you're trying to... That's crazy. She probably went into a spin or something.
Unable to maintain lift, the aircraft fell out of the sky, and the left wing clipped a tree before crashing into the river below. The worst part about this entire story, though, is that screams were heard coming from the wreckage as the aircraft sank into the water. Eyewitnesses that tried to help save them had difficulty making it to the wreckage from the shoreline, and despite their concerns about the crocodile-infested waters, they eventually made it to the aircraft, but they couldn't get in and had to use an axe to cut a hole in the plane, but by then it was too late. Sadly, no one survived, but now that you understand what happened, it's time to talk about why and what I think was the real pilot mistake that got Nicole.
That's awful. That's way worse than I actually thought it was going to be. Take this lesson forward, guys. Man, take this fucking lesson forward. That's heartbreaking. That's heartbreaking.
And everyone else killed. When they recovered the wreckage from the river, the flaps were found in the retracted position, and the investigation concluded that Nicole raised the flaps too early, which is what caused her to crash. But I'd argue it was a different mistake that got Nicole and everyone else killed. First of all, there wasn't any evidence to prove that she retracted the flaps too early, and the truth is that it's possible that she tried to take off with the flaps already retracted, but we'll never know for sure. According to the Pilot Operating Handbook, the stall speed of the Cessna 210 can be as low as 56 to 65 knots, depending on the position of the flaps and several other factors, but that's just a rule of thumb because you can stall an aircraft at any airspeed. All you need to do is exceed the critical angle of attack.
Yeah, I think that turn being too steep is probably what did it. Maybe they turned too low. Maybe she turned too low to the surface.
You can see in this table how your stall speed changes based on your center of gravity, the flaps, the bank angle, and the weight of the aircraft. And according to the aircraft data, Nicole was only doing about 60 knots ground speed when she got airborne. And considering she had an 8-knot direct headwind, her indicated airspeed was probably about 68 knots. Now that might have been just barely enough, but I'd argue that the real mistake that got her killed was instead of flying straight ahead and giving the aircraft time to accelerate, she was likely distracted by trying to talk on the radio. As a result, instead of climbing out wings level until she was at least 400 feet above the ground and at a safe airspeed, she started her left-hand turn when she was abeam the departure end of the runway.
Yeah, that's exactly what I would suspect. Low speed, early turn.
And only 212 feet above the ground. As she made that turn, her ground speed never got faster than 61 knots. And if we go back to this table right here, you can see that it's only a 1 knot difference in stall speed between the flaps being up or at 10 degrees. But more importantly, the stall speed in a 30-degree bank turn was about 69 to 70 knots. However, I'm sure the real number was higher than that considering the density altitude was 5,500 feet and the aircraft was slightly overweight, so Nicole was going way too slow to try and make that turn. I think there's a chance they could have survived if Nicole had allowed the aircraft to accelerate by delaying the turn, but I also think that she just didn't have the experience to know what to expect in a situation like this.
Yeah, and not enough time to react. Like at 200 feet, it's a matter of seconds. She would have had to have leveled out the plane, pushed forward, which is probably counterintuitive. You have to be trained to do this type of things because it's counterintuitive to do them naturally.
And if the company she was working for had briefed her about the airfield or provided a little more oversight, then this might not have happened. Either way, it was a heartbreaking tragedy, and I hope that the lessons it offers help save lives in the future. And if you learned something, then you should watch this video on the screen where I've gone back and completely reworked the investigations for the 5 most reckless pilot mistake stories on this channel. And I even included a bonus story about a tragedy caused by 2 reckless pilots that I've never shared.
Well, damn. Yeah, like you said, I hope this video reveals mistakes and stuff we can all learn from. Like most of these videos I've watched, the mistake has always been human error. Human arrogance, human error, you name it, lack of experience. It's almost never the aircraft itself. But yeah, so this is Pilot Debrief. He's a great channel. I watch him quite often. It's it's kind of something I do to keep in the mindset of flying, and I like to learn from mistakes other people have made. But yeah, thanks so much for coming and watching, and I hope you guys have a great day. Bye bye.